I didn't cry because I was lost, I cried because the place everyone told me to run from was the only place that had been waiting for me all along. At 2:13 in the morning, a county sheriff found me sitting on the cold stone steps of an abandoned church 3 miles outside Millfield, Pennsylvania, still wearing the same black dress I had worn to my husband Daniel Whitmore's funeral. The January air was sharp enough to sting my face, the kind of cold that sneaks through wool coats and settles into your bones, and the only light came from a flickering street lamp at the edge of the cracked parking lot. My heels were muddy. My hands were shaking. My mascara had dried in thin grey lines under my eyes, and in my left palm, I held Daniel's wedding ring so tightly that the inside edge had left a red mark across my skin. The sheriff stepped out of his cruiser slowly, like he was afraid a sudden movement might break me. He was a tall man with tired eyes, a brown jacket, and the soft voice people use around widows and frightened children. He said, keeping both hands where I could see them, "Are you hurt? Are you lost?" I looked up at him, but I couldn't answer because the truth was too large to fit inside a simple sentence. Behind him, the old white church leaned against the dark sky like a memory nobody wanted to claim. Its windows were boarded, its paint was peeling, and the sign near the road still carried the faded word St. Agnes Chapel, though no service had been held there in almost 20 years. I had never been there before that night. At least, I didn't remember being there. But Daniel had. He had been coming there for months, maybe years, without telling me. I only knew because of the ring. Earlier that evening, after the funeral reception ended and the last of the Whitmore relatives had finished whispering about me as if grief had made me deaf, I had gone upstairs to our bedroom to pack the few things Daniel's mother believed still belonged to me. Margaret Whitmore had stood in the doorway of the grand house on Oak Hollow Drive and told me, with perfect posture and a pearl necklace resting against her throat, that I should leave before sunrise. She said the house was a family property, that Daniel's affairs would be handled by people who understood them, and that I should not make an already painful day more embarrassing. I did not argue. I had learned long ago that some people mistake silence for weakness simply because they have never seen what silence can survive. I folded Daniel's navy sweater, the one that still smelled faintly like cedar and coffee, and that was when his wedding ring slipped from the pocket. I thought it had been placed in the funeral home's memory box, but there it was, rolling across the hardwood floor until it stopped beneath the bed. When I picked it up, I noticed something I had never seen before. Inside the gold band, where I expected only our wedding date, there was a tiny engraving, almost hidden by where, SAC, 3 miles east, midnight if they lie. My breath caught. Daniel had always been sentimental, but he was not mysterious, or at least I had believed he wasn't. I turned the ring beneath the bedside lamp again and again until the letters blurred. SAC St. Agnes Chapel. I did not know how I knew that, only that the name rose in my mind with the heaviness of something buried. So while Margaret's guests drank coffee downstairs and spoke about estate matters before my husband's flowers had even wilted, I walked out through the side door, drove east on a 2-lane road lined with bare trees, and followed a memory I did not understand. Now, sitting in front of that abandoned church, I was not crying because I had nowhere to go. I was crying because Daniel had left me a map inside the one thing I thought symbolized our marriage, and every inch of that map was pointing toward a truth his family had spent my entire life trying to hide. The sheriff asked me twice if there was someone he could call, and both times I almost gave him Margaret Whitmore's number out of habit, the way a person reaches for a doorknob in a house that has already burned down. But then I remembered her face at the funeral reception, calm as polished marble, watching me from across the Whitmore living room while everyone else pretended not to hear what she had said. Daniel had been buried. Less than 6 hours earlier beneath a grey Pennsylvania sky, and the house had smelled of lilies, black coffee, and old money. Men in dark suits stood near the fireplace discussing probate as if my husband had been a business transaction that had finally closed. Women with careful hair and pearl earrings touched my shoulder for half a second, then leaned toward one another to whisper. I heard my name again and again, always followed by something soft and sharp. Poor Claire. She has no idea. Daniel protected her from everything. She will be completely lost now. I stood beside the grand piano with a paper cup of coffee going cold in my hand, trying to remember how to breathe in a room where every portrait on the wall seemed to belong to someone who would never have approved of me. The Whitmores had lived in Millfield for generations, in a white columned house at the end of a private road, the kind of place where even the family dogs had better manners than most people. I had grown up 20 miles away in a rented duplex behind a gas station, raised by parents who taught me to work hard, pay my bills, and never sit at a table where people made you feel grateful for crumbs. Daniel never cared about that difference. He used to say that kindness was the only inheritance that mattered. His mother disagreed. Margaret had never raised her voice at me, not once in the 7 years I had known her, because women like Margaret did not need volume. They could make a person feel small with a pause, a smile, or the way they said the word dear. At the reception, she waited until most of the guests had drifted toward the dining room before she approached me. She wore a black dress that looked expensive enough to have its own insurance policy, and her silver hair was pinned so perfectly it seemed untouched by grief. "Claire," she said, placing one cool hand on my arm, "this has been a difficult day for everyone. I think it would be best if you gathered your personal belongings tonight." I stared at her, unsure I had heard correctly. "Tonight?" She gave me the kind of sympathetic smile people give when they have already decided your place in the world. "Daniel's affairs are complicated. The house, the accounts, the family holdings, those matters will be handled properly. You do not need to involve yourself in things you would not understand." Across the room, Daniel's cousin Everett looked away. His Aunt Patricia suddenly became fascinated by the rim of her teacup. No one defended me. No one even looked surprised. That was when I understood that this had not been decided in grief. It had been waiting for me. Margaret leaned closer, lowering her voice just enough to make it feel private and humiliating at the same time. Daniel was generous. Sometimes too generous. But generosity should not be mistaken for entitlement. My throat tightened, but I refused to cry in front of her. Not there. Not with Daniel's photograph resting beside a vase of white roses and his family measuring my worth by the size of the suitcase I could carry out. I was his wife, I said quietly. Margaret's eyes softened in the cruelest way. "Yes, dear. And now you are his widow." The word settled over me like frost. A few minutes later, I walked upstairs while the floorboards creaked under my shoes and the voices downstairs faded into the low hum of people who had already erased me. In our bedroom, Daniel's side of the closet was still open. His watch sat on the dresser. His reading glasses lay beside the book he would never finish. For a moment, the room looked so normal that I almost expected him to step out of the bathroom and ask why everyone was acting like the world had ended. Instead, I opened a small suitcase and began folding my life into it while the house that had never welcomed me waited for me to disappear. I packed 2 sweaters, a framed photograph from our trip to Maine, and the navy scarf Daniel bought me at a little store in Boston because he said it matched my eyes. That was when I found the ring, and that was when the night stopped being about grief and became something much darker, much older, and much closer than I was ready to understand. I did not leave through the front door because I could already imagine Margaret standing in the foyer, watching me with that quiet satisfaction she tried to disguise as concern. Instead, I carried my suitcase down the back staircase, past the laundry room, through the mudroom where Daniel's old hiking boots still sat beneath the bench, and out into the frozen dark. My car was parked near the service driveway, half hidden beneath bare maple branches, and when I opened the door the dome light made Daniel's ring glow in my palm like a warning. For a full minute, I sat behind the wheel without turning the key, listening to the muffled sound of voices drifting from the house. They were still in there, drinking coffee from china cups, discussing Daniel's life as if I had only been a temporary guest in it. I looked down at the engraving again, St. Agnes Chapel, 3 miles east, midnight if they lie. The words felt impossible, but they also felt exactly like Daniel. Not the secrecy, not the fear hidden between the letters, but the care. He had known there would come a night when I would be alone, humiliated, and unsure whom to trust, and somehow he had placed a message where only I would think to look. I drove away from Oak Hollow Drive without turning on the radio. The road east of Millfield narrowed quickly, passing dark fields, split-rail fences, and mailboxes leaning under thin crusts of ice. Snow from earlier in the week still clung to the ditches in dirty white piles, and every few seconds my headlights caught the silver flash of frost on the trees. The farther I drove, the more the Whitmore house seemed to vanish behind me, but the feeling in my chest only grew heavier. Daniel had always told me that his family history was complicated. I thought he meant old money, old grudges, old expectations. I did not think he meant hidden chapels and secret messages carved into wedding rings. At 11:58, I saw the sign for St. Agnes. It stood crooked near a gravel turnoff, the paint so faded that I almost missed it. The chapel sat at the end of a short lane surrounded by winter weeds and leafless oaks, its small steeple cutting into the moonless sky. There were no houses nearby, no passing cars, no sound except the wind moving across the fields. I parked beside a rusted chain-link gate and stepped out, my heels sinking into the damp ground. The front doors were closed, but not locked. When I pushed one open, it groaned so loudly that I froze, half expecting someone to answer from the darkness. No one did. Inside, the air smelled like dust, old wood, and rainwater. The pews were still there, lined in two neat rows, their red cushions faded almost brown. A few hymnals sat forgotten in the racks, curled with age. I took out my phone and used the flashlight, sweeping the beam over the cracked plaster walls, the empty altar, and the stained glass window above it, where a pale blue figure looked down with a face too gentle for that place. I whispered Daniel's name once, not because I expected him to answer, but because the silence felt too complete without it. Then I saw the initials carved into the side of the old confessional, D.W. They were small, careful, and low enough that no one would notice unless they were searching for them. My hand trembled as I pulled open the narrow wooden door. Inside, behind the kneeler, one panel sat slightly raised. I pressed it with my thumb, and it shifted. Behind it was a small cedar box wrapped in a strip of dark cloth. For a moment, I could not move. I knew, with a certainty that frightened me, that whatever was inside would divide my life into before and after. When I opened the box, I found a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon, several photographs, hospital records yellowed at the edges, and a small digital recorder sealed in a plastic bag. On top of everything was a note in Daniel's handwriting. Claire, listen before you decide what to believe. I sat on the floor of that abandoned chapel, my black dress gathering dust, and pressed play. Daniel's voice filled the darkness, low and strained, but unmistakably his. Claire, if you are hearing this, it means I was right to be afraid, and it means my family has already started telling you their version of the truth. Daniel's voice was not the voice he used at dinner parties or on Sunday mornings when he made pancakes and pretended he knew how to flip them. It was slower, careful, as if every word had been chosen in a room where even the walls could not be trusted. I need you to understand something before anyone else reaches you, he said through the tiny recorder, and the sound of him made my chest ache so deeply I had to press one hand against the floor to steady myself. What happened to me was not just bad luck, Claire. I cannot prove what I suspect yet, but I have spent the last 14 months finding patterns where my family told me there were only coincidences. The chapel seemed to shrink around me. Dust floated through the beam of my phone flashlight, and outside, the wind pushed against the old windows with a low, steady moan. Daniel continued, explaining that after his father, William Whitmore, passed away years earlier, the family closed certain accounts, sealed old records, and dismissed longtime employees without explanation. At the time, Daniel had been young enough to believe grief made rich families strange. But after we married, he began noticing how Margaret reacted to me. Not with ordinary disapproval, not with the polite distance of a mother who thought her son had married beneath him, but with something sharper, almost personal. She watched you like she recognized you, Daniel said. And every time I asked why, she told me I was being dramatic. I picked up the first photograph from the cedar box. It showed a younger William Whitmore standing in front of St. Agnes Chapel, his brown hair windblown, his hand resting gently on the shoulder of a woman I had never seen before. She was smiling at a baby wrapped in a pale yellow blanket. On the back, in faded blue ink, someone had written, June 3, 1990, St. Agnes, before everything changed. My fingers went cold. I was born in June of 1990. The date meant nothing by itself, I told myself. Plenty of babies were born in June. Plenty of families had old photographs. But then I found another picture. This one showed the same baby, a little older, sitting on a picnic blanket beside a silver rattle. The child had a tiny crescent-shaped birthmark near her left collarbone. My hand moved to my own collarbone before I could stop it. I had the same mark. My mother, the woman who raised me, always called it my little moon. I had never questioned why she looked sad whenever she said it. The recorder clicked softly as Daniel paused. Then resumed. If you have found the photographs, you have seen enough to know why I kept digging. I went to the county archive first. Then the hospital. Then a retired nurse in Harrisburg who remembered a fire report that never matched the birth records. Claire, your adoption file was not normal. Your name was changed. Your birth certificate was replaced. And every time I got close to the original documents, someone from my family already knew. I looked down at the hospital records in the box. Some pages were copies, some were handwritten notes, and one had my adoptive parents' last name typed beside a different name that had been crossed out so heavily I could barely read it. But beneath the black ink, under the pressure marks on the paper, I could make out two words, Whitmore infant. The air left my lungs. For years, Margaret had treated me like an intruder who had wandered into a house above my station. But the papers in front of me suggested something far more disturbing. I had not wandered into the Whitmore family by marrying Daniel. I had been connected to them long before I ever knew his name. Daniel's voice lowered, full of sorrow and warning. My father had a daughter before he married my mother. A baby girl everyone was told died during a fire near the old chapel. But I found proof she lived. I found proof she was placed with another family. And Claire, I believe that child was you. The recorder kept playing, but for several seconds I heard nothing except my own heartbeat. The chapel floor beneath me felt unsteady, as if the whole building had shifted. I thought of Margaret telling me to gather my belongings. I thought of the relatives whispering that I had no idea. I thought of Daniel looking at me in our kitchen 2 weeks before his accident, holding my face between his hands and saying, "No matter what happens, promise me you will remember that you belong somewhere." At the time, I thought he meant with him. Now, surrounded by old records and the ghost of his voice, I realized he had been trying to tell me I belonged to a truth that had been stolen before I was old enough to speak. For a long time, I sat on that chapel floor with Daniel's recorder in one hand and the hospital record in the other, unable to decide which part of my life had been real. The woman who raised me had loved me. That much I knew with a certainty no paper could erase. She had packed my school lunches, waited in the parking lot after cheer practice, and stayed awake during every winter fever with a wet washcloth and a prayer. My father had taught me how to check the oil in my car and how to tip waitresses even when money was tight. They were my parents in every way that mattered, but the file in my lap told me there had been another beginning, one hidden behind sealed records, quiet payments, and names crossed out with black ink. I pressed the recorder again, and Daniel's voice returned, softer now, almost breaking beneath the weight of what he had carried alone. "I did not tell you at first because I was afraid of what it would do to you. Then I was afraid of what my mother would do if she knew I had found you. I kept thinking I needed one more document, one more witness, one more piece strong enough that no one could call it grief, imagination, or coincidence." I closed my eyes and saw him at our kitchen table late at night, his laptop open, a mug of untouched coffee beside him, telling me he was reviewing contracts for the foundation. I had kissed his shoulder and told him not to work too hard. He had smiled, but now I understood the tiredness behind his eyes. He had not been protecting business secrets. He had been protecting me from the family that smiled at me across dinner tables while knowing exactly who I might be. The next paper in the box was a copy of an old trust amendment signed by William Whitmore in 1991, 1 year after the date on the photograph. most of the legal language blurred together, but one sentence stood out because Daniel had underlined it in red: any living biological child of William H. Whitmore, acknowledged or unacknowledged, shall retain equal claim to the founder's private trust upon verified identity. My hands went numb. Equal claim. Verified identity. Those words sounded less like family and more like a locked door with my name hidden behind it. Beneath that document was a letter. From a retired nurse named Linda Carver, written on plain stationery from Harrisburg. She said she had worked at Millfield County Hospital the summer I was born. She remembered a baby girl transferred under unusual instructions, remembered a woman crying in a private room, remembered a Whitmore attorney arriving before sunrise with forms that did not match the hospital chart. She had stayed silent for years because she was young, afraid, and told that rich families handled private matters privately. But when Daniel found her, she agreed to write down what she knew because, as she put it, no child should spend a lifetime being treated like a secret. That sentence broke something in me. I had spent years wondering why Margaret looked at me with such controlled dislike, why every family gathering felt like a test I had not been told I was taking, why Daniel sometimes held me in quiet moments with a sadness I could feel but not name. Now the answer sat in my lap, page after page. Margaret had not seen a poor girl who married above her place. She had seen proof that the past had survived. The recorder clicked again, and Daniel took a long breath. There is one more thing, Claire. My mother does not know I copied the final file. It proves the chapel was not just where the old photograph was taken. It was where your mother tried to leave evidence before she disappeared from the records. Look behind the loose stone under the left side of the altar. If it is still there, you will find the part one could never bring myself to remove. I stood on unsteady legs, my knees stiff from the cold floor, and walked toward the altar with my phone light shaking across the cracked tiles. The left side looked ordinary at first, just dust and old wood and the shadow of a broken candle stand. Then I saw it, one pale stone slightly raised above the others. I knelt, worked my fingers around the edge, and lifted it free. Beneath it was a flat metal tin, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a faded yellow ribbon. Inside was a tiny silver rattle, the same one from the photograph, and a handwritten note so old the paper felt fragile as a dried leaf. The words were simple, desperate, and unmistakably meant for the child who had been taken from that story before she could remember it. Her name is not gone. Her name is Caroline Whitmore. Please let her know she was loved. For the first time that night, I said the name out loud. Caroline Whitmore. The chapel did not answer, but something inside me did. It was not recognition exactly, because I had lived 34 years as Claire Whitmore, Claire Parker before marriage, Claire from the duplex behind Miller's Gas and Grocery, Claire who clipped coupons with her mother on Sunday afternoons and learned early that new shoes were for the first day of school, not for every season. But the name Caroline moved through me like a door opening in a house I had never known I owned. I held the note beneath my phone light and read it again, slower this time, letting each word settle where panic had been. Her name is not gone. Her name is Caroline Whitmore. Please let her know she was loved. Loved. That was the word that finally brought me to my knees. Not heir. Not trust. Not document. Loved. Because money could explain greed, records could explain secrecy, and family pride could explain cruelty, but love was the part no one at Oak Hollow Drive had ever offered me. I picked up the silver rattle from the tin and turned it over in my palm. On the handle, so faint I almost missed it, were the initials CW engraved beneath a tiny crescent moon. My little moon. My mother's voice came back to me so clearly that for a second I could smell the lemon dish soap in our old kitchen and hear the hum of the refrigerator we could never afford to replace. She had not known everything, I realized, but she had known enough to hold sadness around my birthday like a secret candle. I pressed the recorder again, and Daniel's voice returned, quieter than before. I need you to know why I married you, because when my mother realizes what you have found, she will try to poison even that. I froze. Of all the things in the box, that was the fear I had been trying not to touch. If Daniel had known who I was before we married, then our entire life together might have been built on guilt, investigation, or some quiet, Mission I never agreed to join. The thought hurt more than Margaret's insults, more than the cold, more than the papers with names crossed out. Daniel seemed to know exactly where my mind would go. I met you at the library fundraiser because you made me laugh in a room full of people pretending to understand art, he said. I asked you to coffee because you looked me in the eye like my last name did not matter. I fell in love with you before I knew anything about the chapel, the hospital, or the girl my family said died before I was old enough to ask questions. I did not find out who you might be until almost 2 years after our wedding, when I saw an old photograph in my father's locked files and realized the baby in that picture had your birthmark. My hand moved again to the crescent near my collarbone. The shame I had not admitted to myself began to loosen. Daniel had not chosen me because I was evidence. He had chosen me because I was me, and when the evidence found him, he had stayed. I should have told you sooner, he continued. That is the part one will never forgive myself for. But every answer opened another danger, and every document led back to my mother's attorneys, her accounts, her version of history. I thought if I moved too soon, she would bury the truth deeper. I thought if I waited, I could give you something no one could take away. There was a rustle on the recording, as if he had shifted papers. Then his voice broke in a way I had heard only once before, the day we learned my adoptive father's heart condition had returned. Claire, you are not a charity case. You are not an outsider. You are not the woman my family allowed into their world by mistake. If the documents are right, you are William Whitmore's daughter, and the Founder's Trust belongs to you as much as it ever belonged to any of them. I stared at the altar, at the cracked white paint, at the pale stone where my birth name had slept in darkness for decades. Somewhere beyond the chapel walls, the sheriff's cruiser would later pull into the lot, and a kind stranger would think he had found a widow too broken to find her way home. But in that moment, before anyone came, before questions, before sirens of concern and voices of pity, I understood why Daniel had hidden the ring message where only love would find it. He had not been leading me away from grief. He had been leading me back to myself. By the time I stepped back outside, the eastern edge of the sky had not changed, but the night felt older, as if I had spent years inside that chapel instead of less than an hour. I carried the cedar box against my chest beneath Daniel's navy scarf, keeping the recorder, the letters, the silver rattle, and the note close enough that my heartbeat seemed to move through them. The cold hit my face first, then the sound of tires on gravel. A pair of headlights swept across the chapel steps, bright and sudden, and for one wild second I thought Margaret had found me. I backed toward the door, my fingers tightening around the box, but the vehicle that stopped near the gate was a county sheriff's cruiser, not a black town car from Oak Hollow Drive. The sheriff stepped out carefully, leaving his door open and the engine running. His nameplate caught the light when he walked closer, Harris. He looked to be in his late 50s, with a grey mustache, tired shoulders, and the kind of calm that belonged to someone who had spent years knocking on doors at the worst moments of people's lives. He called softly, "My name is Sheriff Harris. Someone reported a vehicle out here after midnight. Are you all right?" I wanted to say yes, because that was the answer women like me learned to give when the truth was too complicated. Yes, I am fine. Yes, I can handle it. Yes, I will leave quietly. But when I opened my mouth, nothing came out. My body had waited until that exact moment to understand what my mind had already seen. Daniel was gone. My name might not be mine. The family that had smiled through my wedding might have known me before I knew myself. And the woman who had thrown me out of her house had not been protecting a legacy. She had been protecting a lie. The tears came so fast I could not stop them. Sheriff Harris climbed the first step but kept a respectful distance. "Did you have an accident? Did you get turned around on the back roads?" I shook my head, but he seemed to read the suitcase in my car, the black dress, the chapel, and the hour, then place all of it into the simplest story available. A grieving widow. A wrong turn. A woman who had lost her husband and did not know where to go next. "I can call someone for you," he said. "Family, maybe." The word almost made me laugh, but the sound that escaped me was closer to a sob. "No," I whispered. Please do not call them." His expression changed slightly, not alarmed, just more careful. "All right. We do not have to call anyone you do not want." He looked past me at the chapel doors, then back at the box in my arms. "Can you tell me what brought you here?" I looked down at Daniel's ring, still looped on my finger now because I could not bear to put it away. The engraving had led me across 3 miles of winter road, but it had really carried me across 34 years of missing history. "My husband did," I said. Sheriff Harris glanced at my dress again. "The funeral was today." I nodded. His face softened with the kind of pity I had been drowning in since morning. "I am sorry, Mrs. Whitmore. Grief can make places feel unfamiliar, even places close to home." He thought he understood. Everyone had thought they understood. Margaret thought I was crying because Daniel's money would no longer shelter me. The relatives thought I was crying because their world had finally pushed me out. The sheriff thought I was crying because sorrow had scattered my sense of direction across the dark roads outside town. But none of them could see what I was holding. None of them knew there was a silver rattle wrapped in cloth beneath my coat, or a note naming me Caroline, or a recording of my dead husband telling me that the life I had been given was only the visible half of a buried story. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, breathing in the cold until my voice steadied. "I know where I am," I told him. "I just did not know who I was when I got here." Sheriff Harris did not speak for a moment. Maybe he heard something in my voice that did not sound like ordinary shock. Maybe he had lived long enough in Millfield to know that old families often kept old secrets in places no one thought to search. Finally, he nodded toward his cruiser. "Then let us get you somewhere warm, and you can tell me what you want to do next." I looked back at St. Agnes Chapel, at the crooked steeple and boarded windows, and I knew the next place I had to go was not warm, kind, or safe. It was the Whitmore house, where Margaret still believed I had left with nothing but a suitcase. Sheriff Harris did not take me back to Oak Hollow Drive immediately, and later I would be grateful for that. He drove me first to the Millfield station, a small brick building beside the courthouse, where the vending machine hummed in the hallway and the night dispatcher gave me a paper cup of coffee I could barely hold. I did not tell him everything, not then. I only told him enough to explain why I had been at St. Agnes Chapel, why I was carrying old documents, and why I did not want Margaret Whitmore notified before I had spoken to an attorney. To his credit, Sheriff Harris did not push. He made 2 copies of the note from the tin, placed the original back in my hands, and told me that if any document involved identity, inheritance, or sealed records, I needed someone who understood the law better than a tired sheriff at 3 in the morning. Daniel had already thought of that. In the cedar box, beneath the letters, was a business card for a woman named Rebecca Sloan, an estate attorney in Harrisburg, with one sentence written on the back in Daniel's handwriting: "She knows enough to start, but not enough to be unsafe." Sheriff Harris let me use the station phone. When Rebecca answered, her voice was calm but instantly awake the moment I said Daniel Whitmore's name. By sunrise, she was driving toward Millfield. By 8:30, I was sitting across from her in a diner booth off Route 22, watching her read the documents while truckers ordered eggs and coffee at the counter like the world had not just split open. Rebecca was in her early 40s, with dark blonde hair pulled into a low bun and a leather briefcase that looked more practical than expensive. She did not gasp. She did not offer pity. She read every page twice, then looked at me over the top of her glasses. "Claire," she said carefully, "if these records are authentic, Daniel was not just leaving you memories. He was building a legal pathway." I stared at the silver rattle wrapped in a napkin beside my untouched toast. A pathway to what? Rebecca tapped the trust amendment with one finger. To recognition. To the founder's private trust. And possibly to a larger claim than Margaret has ever allowed anyone to discuss. The word recognition sounded strange, almost too clean for something that had left so much damage in its wake. I had not come looking for money. I had come because my husband had hidden a map in his wedding ring and a dead woman's note had given me a name I did not know how to carry. But Rebecca explained that old families often protected secrets through paperwork, and paperwork was also how those secrets could be pulled into daylight. She called a lab in Harrisburg that handled legal identity testing. She called a retired judge who owed Daniel a favor. She called the county clerk and requested certified copies of records connected to William H. Whitmore, St. Agnes Chapel, and the sealed transfer from 1990. Every call was quiet, precise, and devastating. By late morning, Daniel's final surprise arrived by courier at the diner, because he had arranged it weeks before his funeral. It was a sealed envelope from his personal safe deposit box, addressed to Rebecca and me. Inside was a flash drive, a notarized statement, and a letter from Daniel dated 10 days before his death. Rebecca read the legal statement first, her face tightening as she moved through each line. Then she handed it to me. Daniel had documented everything: the photographs, the nurse's statement, the missing hospital chart, the trust language, and his fear that Margaret would remove me from the house before I understood my rights. He had also scheduled the formal reading of his will for that afternoon at 2 o'clock, not at Margaret's private office as she wanted, but at the Whitmore house, with all primary relatives present and Rebecca Sloan named as my legal representative. I looked up from the page, my hand suddenly steady. "She thinks I am gone," I said. Rebecca closed her briefcase. "Then we should not disappoint her too early." At 1:45, a black sedan pulled through the iron gates of Oak Hollow Drive with Rebecca beside me and Sheriff Harris following at a respectful distance in his cruiser. The house rose ahead of us, white columns bright against the pale winter sky, every window polished, every hedge trimmed, every inch designed to make outsiders feel smaller. But this time, I was not arriving as the widow Margaret had ordered to leave. I was arriving with Daniel's voice, my birth name, and the first proof that the woman they had dismissed might be the one person in that room they should have feared underestimating. When Rebecca and I walked into the Whitmore house, the first thing I noticed was that Margaret had removed my coat from the hall closet. It was such a small cruelty, almost laughable compared with everything else, but it told me exactly how sure she had been that I would never return. The living room had been arranged for the will reading with the same cold perfection as the funeral reception. The fire was lit, the silver tray held coffee cups, and Daniel's relatives sat in a half circle as if they had gathered for a board meeting instead of the final wishes of a man they claimed to mourn. Margaret stood near the mantel in a charcoal dress, one hand resting lightly on the back of a wing chair. When she saw me, her expression did not break, but her fingers tightened against the fabric. "Claire," she said, making my name sound like an inconvenience. "This is a private family matter." Rebecca stepped forward before I could answer. "Mrs. Whitmore is Daniel's legal spouse, and I am her attorney. We will be staying." A silence moved through the room. Everett looked at the briefcase in Rebecca's hand. Patricia glanced toward Margaret, waiting for instruction. Margaret's smile sharpened. "How quickly you found representation." I looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time I did not see a powerful woman. I saw someone who had spent decades standing guard over a locked door, terrified that the person on the other side might learn how to open it. "Daniel helped me," I said. That was the first crack. It passed across her face so quickly that anyone else might have missed it, but I did not. The family attorney, Mr. Callahan, cleared his throat and began with the ordinary language of estate proceedings: assets, accounts, instructions, personal effects. I barely heard him until Rebecca placed Daniel's sealed statement on the table. "Before distribution is discussed," she said, "there are identity documents and trust provisions that must be entered into record." Margaret's voice dropped. "This is neither the time nor the place." Rebecca did not look away. Daniel chose the time. Daniel chose the place. She opened the folder and laid out the photographs first, then the hospital records, then Linda Carver's signed statement, then the trust amendment bearing William Whitmore's signature. Each page landed on the polished table with a quiet finality that felt louder than shouting. Margaret looked at the documents as if they were insects crawling across her furniture. Old papers proved nothing. Rebecca connected the flash drive to a small laptop. Daniel's voice filled the room, steady despite the faint strain beneath it. He explained the records, the missing file, the chapel, the trust, and the child named Caroline Whitmore who had been declared gone while proof of her life was hidden. No one moved. Even the fire seemed to quiet. When Daniel said that he believed I was William's daughter, Everett whispered, "My God," and Patricia covered her mouth with both hands. Margaret remained perfectly still until Daniel's recording reached the part about her attorneys. Then she stood. "Turn that off." Rebecca paused the recording but did not close the laptop. A legal identity test has already been initiated. Certified records have been requested. Until verification is complete, no estate action involving the founder's private trust should proceed without preserving Mrs. Whitmore's potential claim. Mr. Callahan removed his glasses slowly, and in that moment I knew Margaret had lost control of the room. Not because everything was finished, but because the story was no longer hers alone to tell. She turned to me, and the polished mask finally slipped just enough for me to see the fear underneath. "You have no idea what you are doing." I thought of my adoptive mother calling my birthmark my little moon. I thought of Daniel sitting alone at our kitchen table, building a bridge to a truth he might never live to hand me. I thought of the note beneath the altar, fragile and waiting in the dark for 34 years. "No," I said quietly. "For the first time, I think I do." Margaret's eyes burned with anger, but she did not come closer. She could not make me leave with a look anymore. She could not reduce me to the poor widow, the grateful outsider, the woman who should pack quietly and disappear before sunrise. Rebecca gathered the documents, and Sheriff Harris, who had remained near the doorway without saying a word, gave me a small nod. I walked to the mantel and picked up Daniel's framed photograph. Margaret's mouth opened, but nothing came out. "This belongs with me," I said. Then I left the Whitmore house through the front door, not the back stairs, not the service entrance, not the shadowed path where they expected unwanted people to vanish. Outside, the winter sun had risen over the long driveway, turning the frost on the grass into silver. I did not know how long the legal fight would take. I did not know what records would be found, what money would be frozen, or what name I would choose when the truth was finally recognized. But I knew this: I had arrived at that house as Claire, the widow they pitied, and I was leaving with Caroline, the child they failed to erase. At the end of the driveway, I looked back once at the white columns and the polished windows, and I understood that home is not always the place that welcomes you first. Sometimes it is the place where your truth was buried, waiting for you to become strong enough to claim it.